Hello, everyone. Usually, after our episodes, my co producers and I break down the episode in the companion podcast that you're familiar with, Norma Jean Discovering Truths. So now I'm going to be joined directly by my co producers, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves.
Hi, Gary. This is Randall Libero.
Hi, and I'm Nina Bosky. I think some people are going to be expecting the whole day of her life. And what we did is we picked several scenes of her last day. When you experience these scenes, part of the reasons why we're doing this is that sometimes to understand the mystery of her death, you've got to start at the beginning. But we're trying to give you some little pebbles here that you can start to connect the dots, because as human beings, we are not just one dimensional. And I think a lot of times in these documentaries, they try to put Marilyn in a box and they try to make her one way. And you're going to see and experience that just like all of us, we have a variety of emotions during the day. So with that said, go for it, Randall.
Gary, let's start with the medications, the two medications, Nembutal and chloral hydrate, that you say killed Marilyn. Can you tell us more about these medications?
Sure, Randall. Nembutal is just a brand name for pentobarbital, and this is a very dangerous barbiturate that can sedate someone and create total anesthesia. Chloral hydrate, on the other hand, is a benzodiazepine, and that class of drugs replace barbiturates in the treatment of anxiety and insomnia. It's addictive, but it's less dangerous than an overdose. But in combination, these two drugs, Nembutal and chloral hydrate, are lethal, and they should never have been concurrently prescribed by Dr. Engelberg.
Is it true that Hyman Engelberg prescribed these medications that killed Marilyn? Didn't he deny prescribing them or some of them?
Well, if we go back to the original investigation in 1962, in the Los Angeles Police Department's death report, Engelberg admitted to police of having prescribed the refill of Nembutal. This was a month's supply of medication refilled only 9 days after the original prescription. So Engelberg essentially provided Marilyn with an access to a lethal supply of medication. Now, 20 years later, during the Los Angeles District Attorney's reinvestigation into her death, Engelberg denied on audio recording ever having prescribed the chloral hydrate. And you probably can find this on YouTube right now. That is the one. He told investigator Al Tomich, "I knew nothing about chloral hydrate. I never used chloral hydrate." In the documentary Marilyn Monroe, The Final Years, Engelberg also asserted, "I never gave her chloral hydrate. She must have bought it in Tijuana, Mexico." But, in more recent years, in Engelberg's later days, I corresponded with him when I was researching my book. And he was very clear with me in our correspondence that he never prescribed the chloral hydrate to Marilyn.
Oh, Gary, little did he know the internet was right around the corner.
The corner, exactly. This was in the early 2000s, and he was in his 90s living in a nursing facility. So his statements are downright lies.
Yeah, they are. And simply because they're so provable at this point. And, who would have ever thought that back in 20 years later in the late 90s that it's on display for everybody to see now. And, the other thing, you have to look back at that time in 1962. Marilyn Monroe and every other celebrity was being given these very, very powerful and potent drugs that could kill you. And they would interlace them with these vitamin B shots, right?
Mm-hmm,
Yes.
yes.
And so back then, the way that they conducted, medicine and how they would doctor was very different than it would be today. But both Engelberg and Dr. Greenson, in my opinion, given what happened with Michael Jackson, would definitely be brought up on charges today. Not back in 1962, but certainly in today's standards.
Well, definitely Engelberg, because he was prescribing these large quantities of dangerous medication. It's interesting that Greenson kind of sidestepped. They had an agreement, these two doctors, that Engelberg would be the prescriber. And we'll hear later in our discussion how Greenson was more of the monitor of the medications. Not to say he never prescribed them, but he was not the primary prescriber. And the doctors are supposed to be consulting and communicating with each other for Marilyn's safety.
So let me ask you, besides the internet and what we now know, is there any other evidence that supports that Engelberg definitely lied?
there's a mountain of evidence that he lied.
Because that's
First,
the thing.
first of all, if you look back in magazines of the era, you might remember Barry Feinstein's famous photograph, the close-up of the bottle of chloral hydrate. In a very close-up image, I believe Feinstein took it with a telephoto lens through the window of Marilyn's sunroom, and it's on her tea table along with a swan ashtray and a pencil holder. Many people believe that was Marilyn's nightstand, but it wasn't. That was a table in her sunroom. And Engelberg's name is clear as day on the label of Marilyn's chloral hydrate bottle. And this was published in Life magazine and in Paris Match. You can Google it right now and find it. And so in the years since Marilyn's death, Engelberg's prescriptions, as well as the prescriptions of other doctors who prescribed to her, but the chloral hydrate prescriptions that were issued in 1962 have gone to auction. These are the facts. Engelberg lied. Engelberg was culpable, and he likely was covering up for himself.
In this episode, it's not really, we've done an investigation series and stuff, so it's not an investigative series that we're doing in this show. But you want to sit there and say to yourself, so much has been put on the Kennedys, the mob, all of this other stuff.
Yeah.
And there's evidence speaking to these two doctors that Engelberg, who definitely lied, but then you have Greenson, who's a total enabler, right? There's the way that they prescribed medicine and took care of Marilyn, again, in today's standards, even though Greenson didn't prescribe the medicine, the way that he would conduct his therapy sessions and have Marilyn over to his house. I mean, there was just a
With
lot
his
of
family. And
there was just a lot of different players. So it's just really interesting when you think about the evidence that is so there in front of us, and yet it gets overlooked time and time again.
And to your point, Nina, we've allowed ourselves to be distracted by the conspiracy theories and the other personalities more distant to Marilyn. And those have overshadowed the closest circle where you should really start in an investigation and look for responsibility. And, there's this belief that sometimes the simplest explanation is probably the most accurate one. And unfortunately, that we tend to believe these conspiracy theories, which are extremely complex and convoluted. So, the rumors about the Kennedys and the mob and all of these others removes the spotlight from the very people who were providing Marilyn with
Who were
this
close to her.
arsenal.
People
Yes,
who were close to her.
these were her nearest, dearest, close. And isn't that the way any police investigation starts? It starts with the spouse, the family, and moves outwards.
Yeah, you got it. But I want to come back to our scene, because in the scene that you just heard, there's other medications that are mentioned in it. Gary, you mentioned something about Greenson and Engelberg, who were supposed to moderate or at least look at how much she was taking. Talk a little bit about that.
In 1962, when the police interviewed the doctors, what the doctors were telling the investigators was that they were trying to reduce Marilyn's intake of barbiturates during that summer. Now, that might have been one of their goals, but it clearly wasn't Dr. Engelberg's goals, because we can see his prescriptions. So, Engelberg is the internist, Greenson is the psychiatrist. They're supposedly decreasing her access to meds over the course of that summer or her last months. Well, all we have to do is take a look at a July 10th, 1962 prescription. So it contradicts everything that was being told to the police.
And here's the other thing, Gary, too, and I think it would be interesting if you could just list some of this medication, because could you imagine, as a human being, you have a mental illness that is acute, that's not being treated properly, you're not sleeping, and then you're on top of it, you're taking all this medication. What is the medication that she was prescribed?
The prescription was for 4 medications, and it was auctioned. It's on the internet. I invite folks to look along with me. He prescribed 50 units of Valmid, 25 units of Seconal, 25 units of Tuinol, and 100 units of Librium. Now, only 3 days earlier, on July 7th, he prescribed 50 units of Librium, bringing the total to 150 units in just 3 days. Now, what are
Wow.
these meds? Valmid is a short-acting sedative. Seconal and Tuinal are very dangerous barbiturates. And Librium is in the same class as chloral hydrate. It's a benzodiazepine, which later replaced the barbiturates. But, to your point, Nina, not only is Marilyn being prescribed all of these meds, but she is already a moderate to high risk person for suicide. Given her history of overdoses, her history of intentional overdoses, her history of mental illness, the intergenerational history, her abuse of prescription drugs. All of this places her at high risk. She tends to be impulsive. She has a history of trauma. She has heightened anxiety. I think their intention was to prevent Marilyn from doctor shopping, and they wanted to gain some control, but they virtually gave her whatever she wanted. And then they had this reckless practice of another doctor, Greenson, going in and physically handling the meds and maybe removing some of them or removing part of the quantity.
Yeah, I think it was
It's
John Greenson that said, her dad would actually go in and look at all the Nembutal that she had, and he would take half the bottle and put it in his pocket. And if you think about that, it's just so ludicrous of how they're handling this situation. And, the other thing, Gary, and we have to mention this, is the distraction that Dr. Engelberg had that summer, because was he going through a separation or a divorce?
Yes, he was separating from his wife and moving out and beginning the process of divorce. And so they allege that the communication between the doctors broke down because of this preoccupation. Now, this is reported by Patricia Newcombe. When we asked for the sources for our information, Joan Greenson, she wrote a memoir which I had access to during my research. And since that time, the Greenson archives, including Joan's manuscript, is now sequestered until, I think, 2039. But this information was available. And another point I want to make is that in this particular prescription for 4 medications, there's 2 of them, the Seconal and Tuinal, that are prescribed concurrent to each other, and these others. These are the 2 medications that Marilyn had told Greenson that she had intentionally overdosed on in the past. So there was a letter that Marilyn wrote to Greenson in 1961, not when he was her attending psychiatrist, but when she was discharged from the psychiatric hospital, and she was under the care of Dr. Chris. She writes in that she tried to do away with herself by taking 10 Seconal and 10 Tuinal. So we know that in the past that these medications were the ones that she resorted to. So I think that makes it all the more concerning. It's already concerning, but it's all the more.
What's so frustrating is we can't go back and ask these guys now, what were you thinking, right? Now we know what we know, right?
And you begin to wonder, was Marilyn colluding with Engelberg against Greenson? How much aware was Greenson? We don't know what really broke down. And that's where I think the focus of the last 60 years should have been, if we want to investigate Marilyn's death and put light on it and try to transform it by bringing about some heightened awareness of these kind of problems. It's the prescribing issue. I think, was this just ignorance of these doctors? I think even by 1962 standards, this is pretty reckless. Although, we have to make the point that the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Team, which was kind of in its infancy, I think it began in about 1958, the first suicide prevention team, they partnered with the coroner to, they were trying to determine if Marilyn's death the overdose was accidental or intentional. That was the big question. They're the ones who interviewed the doctors and said that the doctors were reducing the amount of the intake of her drugs, and that they had been partially successful with this. I'd have to laugh at that when I see these prescriptions.
And here's the other thing too, is that, there's a lot of time between Marilyn's death and the police coming. And it's interesting is that we always focus on the externals again, but it's the 2 doctors. Dr. Greenson calls Dr. Engelberg. And I always thought that was a little strange. I understand it. She's a big star, etc. But you could make the jump and say they had to get their story straight of what.
Or it was an OMG moment when maybe both doctors were now aware of the prescribing practices of one of them, or
Yeah.
that something broke down. I think there was a lot to talk about because we've seen the picture of Marilyn's nightstand, and it's like 11 pill bottles, right? The police, I think, report a certain number. They say that there's maybe about 15, and that's what you kind of see on the table, because it's kind of hard to see. But then less than 15 are actually being documented in the toxicology report. So, I mean, the visual of those medications would have been stunning. Now, only a few hours earlier, Dr. Greenson was there. There's been a lot of question about whether the Nembutal was present in the room when Engelberg was there with her, or if it was in another room.
And here's the thing. I want to say one more thing before we close out this scene, before we get to the next scene, because this day in the life of Marilyn, there's a lot of stuff going on. And this one thing that I think is really, really interesting is that we get this, Gary, you get this asked, I get this asked a lot, is, well, she had to have been murdered because there was no crystals in her stomach. Oh my gosh, if I hear that one more time. You know, we interviewed Dr. Cyril Weck. He broke it down for us.
Yes.
So explain
Yeah.
that to us one more time.
I think this really stems from lay people like me, maybe trying
And
to
me.
trying to sift through medical information when we're unqualified to do that. And so maybe by conventional wisdom, that might make sense. But medically, in the field of pathology, Marilyn's autopsy reflects exactly what we would expect from an oral ingestion of medication. And I had to educate myself about this. So, because there was a time when I believed differently because of conventional wisdom, maybe. So, I think the first point is that medications, especially sedative medications, are not like food. You know, food sits in the stomach and is digested, but medications are designed to break down and absorb quickly into the body and into the bloodstream so that they work. So in the example of these sedative drugs taken even to help with sleep, we wouldn't expect them to have this residue, to find them in the stomach all of these hours later. If that were the case, they would take forever to work. Could you imagine that, you know, if you wanted to go to bed at 9 o'clock, you'd have to take the pill maybe at 3 in the afternoon or 6 in the afternoon so it could lay in the stomach and then break down, and then there'd be evidence of it? Well, then how would it ever absorb to work? So
Yeah.
these things work quickly. You know, you take a pill and you get, or you drink alcohol, and you immediately feel the reaction of that. And that happens soon. And that's because the gelatin breaks down and the drug is absorbed quickly into the body. So what's interesting about Marilyn's case is that there's a higher level of the drug in the liver and there's a lower level of the drug in the blood. And this is consistent with an oral overdose because the body has metabolized the drug and it's now being processed and stored in the liver. So if the level of drug had been higher in the bloodstream, it would suggest that maybe it was administered through an injection, you know, the theory of the enema, or, you know, that she, you know, died
Well,
before it
and
got
let's get
absorbed.
right to the point too, Gary, is the fact that most people don't know this. They always say to us, you know, she was injected, or, you know, there was some kind of enema, right? And the reality is that we know based on her autopsy report, based on the science, not based on the conspiracy theory, based on the science, that she died over time, which gives
Yes.
that
Mhm.
breakdown time to happen.
Yeah.
Yes, unfortunately, Marilyn lingered in a comatose state for a period of time. Now, she was probably unconscious, and we'd like to think that she wasn't suffering, but she went probably into a stupor, and her body continued to function and process, and her body metabolized the drug that was in her, and that's why we don't see any residue. This is expected. And what happens is the body begins to shut down. And, you know, her autopsy report was especially detailed for 1962, more so than if she were not a celebrity. And that was because the coroner's department knew that there would be a spotlight on this death in the way that they handled it. So they wanted to be very thorough by their standards. And so they put information in the autopsy report, such as there was a purplish discoloration of the colon. Now, many people have turned to that to say, well, that's evidence of perhaps the enema. And you might not have seen that in anyone's autopsy at the time, but what that really speaks to is that the organs were starting to shut down and die. And the purplish discoloration is actually lividity in these
Yeah,
organs that are further from the heart. And so that
exactly.
Dr. Cyril Weck
Yeah.
talked to us about the agonal death process, which was new
Well,
information
and
to me. And
we'll
that's that process, the slow process of dying.
And I think this is just important to give some context in regards to the pills that Marilyn was actually picking up that day, the last day of her life. Can you set up the scene, our next experience of the last day of Marilyn's life?
As people know, at that point in her life, there was a lot going on in terms of 20th Century Fox Studios and her termination from Fox and the reasons around that. But what happened after that is what we're going to show you in this scene. And it's a conversation between Pat Newcombe and Marilyn about everything going on in her career, and it's a business conversation that they have. And we have this scene because we want to give you an idea of emotionally what Marilyn was going through, dealing with everything in her life.
And Patricia Newcomb, for those of you who are just listening in, was her PR agent for the Arthur Jacobs agency. So let's check this next scene out. It's another part of Marilyn's last day.
Wow, that was a pretty intense scene. So we're picking up our conversation in this last day episode of Marilyn's life, and I'm joined again by my collaborators, Gary and Nina. So in this scene, you heard a conversation between Marilyn and Pat, and they're talking about many aspects of what was going on in Marilyn's career and what they were planning for her future. One of the things that we wanted to illustrate was really Marilyn's mood on that day. And this is in the afternoon of the day of her death. So we wanted to give you a sense of what was going through her mind, and especially to highlight the mental health aspects of her mood that day. Gary, there's a lot of speculation on Marilyn's mood that last day of her life. Was she happy? Was she depressed? So what do we know?
Well, the conspiracy theorists have offered outlandish speculation about her mood that day, but what do we know factually? So what we know is that Marilyn had experienced a severe depressive episode in the late spring of 1962 while she was in production on Something's Got to Give. And this was when Dr. Greenson traveled to Europe and Israel, and she went into crisis. And following that, she was terminated from the film. And so she remained in a depressive episode right after she was terminated. She was described as agitated, paranoid of the intentions of others. And so the suicide prevention team, when they investigated her death, they spoke to the psychiatrists who treated her in New York and Los Angeles. So they spoke to Dr. Marianne Chris, who was her psychiatrist for many years in New York until 1961, and the doctors who treated her at Payne Whitney Psychiatric Institute and Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. And they concluded, and I'm going to quote this directly from their report, Marilyn Monroe had suffered from psychiatric disturbances for a long time. She experienced severe fears and frequent depressions. Mood changes were abrupt and unpredictable. Among symptoms of disorganization, sleep disturbances were prominent, for which she had been taking sedative drugs for many years. She was thus familiar and experienced in the use of sedative drugs and well aware of their dangers. So, according to Dr. Engelberg in his last years and in his correspondence with me, and he said that he and Dr. Greenson were both aware that Marilyn was suffering from what was called at the time manic depression, which we now know as bipolar disorder or the bipolar disorder
Well,
spectrum.
and Gary, you also talk about this in relation to mixed episodes, and you had to educate me on this because I had no idea what that term meant. So, what does that mean as it relates to Marilyn's case?
In bipolar disorder, there are episodes of depression, which I think we could more readily recognize, and mania or hypomania. And that part of the illness is characterized more by impulsivity, poor judgment, irritability, the inability to sleep. And a lot of people have challenged me on perceiving Marilyn's disorder as on the bipolar spectrum. But I think what really seals the deal on that is her sleep disturbances. Joan Greenson and others have said that, especially that last summer of her life, her main challenge was she just couldn't sleep. She couldn't sleep for days and days and days. And this is why she turned to the medications and why she abused the prescription drugs, just trying to sleep. And that is a clear sign of mania or hypomania. The mixed episode is when someone experiences both depression and mania or hypomania at the same time. And that is particularly dangerous because folks in that state are more at risk for taking their lives because they're severely depressed, but now they have the poor judgment and the impulsivity to actually take action.
Let's break it down for the audience in kind of simple terms because I think they'll relate to this, particularly if you have an opinion on what happened to her. So all of us here, Randall, Gary, me, we have all experienced this. She was so happy right before she passed away. Her career was on an upswing. Oh man, she was so depressed. She was just a tragic figure. And we try to put Marilyn in a box, just like a human being in a box. And when you start to look at her mental condition and what was going on with her, it starts to make sense that she's not going to be just all happy or all sad or depressed or excited. I can have the intention that I am going to overcome my career challenges and I am going to be a really huge success. And I can have an intellectual, intelligent intention. However, my emotional foundation and my, chemistry makeup, if that's not supporting that intellectual intention, I'm sorry, it's just never going to happen. It's going to be fragmented.
And for Marilyn, what was characteristic of her was she was very well known to have very abrupt mood changes, mood swings. And this is a symptom of bipolar disorder and, characteristic of other disorders that were concurrent with the one that she had. There were times that she was very happy. There were times that that's the whole nature of bipolar,
Yeah.
the ups and the downs. And it's more than just personality driven. This is
And,
chemically driven by
and
the
let,
serotonin levels in the brain.
And also, let's get to the irritability because I know, Randall, you have some really good thoughts around this too with Pat Newcombe. There's a lot of stories, and it's been said that Pat Newcombe, Marilyn was very irritable that day and specifically upset with Pat Newcombe. But let's talk a little bit more about why we put that scene in here and to show that relationship.
Marilyn, I think, was described as grouchy and irritable and unable to sleep by Patricia Newcombe. So that's an important point. And you can hear in the scene that we played for you that her attitude of she's really struggling to deal with Marilyn's emotional mood swings. And you hear that in the episode, and that's the way we crafted it. But there was a lot of things going on with Marilyn that day, as she's described as not taking care of herself. She's not dressing, she's not combing her hair, she's drinking grapefruit juice, and a number of things that she didn't hardly eat anything, and she's taking all these medications. So obviously anyone knows what happens with that with the body. That's, I think, a major point that we have to be aware of. And we work to illustrate that a little bit in the scene for you.
And Gary, and you have talked to Pat Newcombe. What do you think about this scene that we just experienced? Does that seem like something that Pat Newcombe and how she would express herself?
All of the facts that that what they're talking about is all based upon what was going on in Marilyn's life. And Marilyn was really struggling to salvage her career. She was being maligned by Fox. It was really a horrible time for Marilyn, and she had to convince the world that she was marketable, that she was employable, and she had to fight the bad press she was getting. And so Pat is a very, very intelligent woman, an analytical woman who had a responsibility to Marilyn's career and was putting things in motion to help salvage that career.
I find it really interesting, though, that in this scene, Marilyn still wanted to be part of Playboy. And yet at the same time, she wanted to be taken as a serious actress. And I found myself wondering how she came to terms with that, in that saying of that, because I could see Pat Newcombe going, wait a minute, I thought you said you wanted to be a serious actress. And here you are going ahead and putting yourself all over Playboy, which gives a very different brand image. What do you think about that?
We took some artistic license with that because I'm not real clear on who was a fan of moving forward with Playboy. I know that Marilyn had expressed interest in it. These were the photographs that Larry Schuller took on the set of Something's Got to Give. He was going to make a lot of money selling this to Playboy and able to buy a home for his wife and his new baby. And Marilyn really wanted to help him do that. At the same time, you have to remember that Elizabeth Taylor was all over the press with her affair while she was married and in production for a long time in Cleopatra, which was wrought with a lot of tension. And Marilyn was getting now negative press, and she really needed to compete and get some positive press. So it's easy to see that a
Yeah.
simple way out would be to rely upon these glamorous, beautiful photos. This was the first semi-nude scene in a major first-rate film. And so it definitely would be a way to attract some attention, some positive attention. But Marilyn was extremely conflicted because she kind of made this agreement with Schiller and then kind of took it back. And even if you listen to his interviews or read his memoir, Marilyn's ambivalent about this. So we try to depict that. Now, Pat Newcombe has gone on record saying that Marilyn could be very challenging. She could be sometimes unreasonable. When she had mood changes,
Yeah.
she would change decisions very rapidly. And one thing that Pat said on record was that Eunice Murray was always very patient with Marilyn, and Pat Newcombe found that very challenging at times because of Marilyn's demeanor. She would sometimes become more impatient with Marilyn than Eunice Murray would. So this was a part of the dynamic between these women. And there was tension between them. Pat Newcombe never identified what that was. She said that it didn't really have any base. It was just a general irritability that Marilyn had, and she didn't take it personally. She didn't think it was really necessarily associated with her, but more symptomatic. Marilyn was dealing with a tremendous amount of stress that summer.
Well, and we're not going to get into it in this episode. Obviously we're still in the adolescence of Marilyn, but being able to look at her death, which so many people, I mean, the part of the reason why we're doing this is we get asked this all the time, and we're
Yeah.
still in finishing up season 1, going into season 2 here, and we're trying to give you some context. So as you go through Marilyn's life and the different episodes in the different seasons, by the time that you get to her last day, and we go into this in much greater detail, you'll be able to put some context around this, and it won't feel so, oh, you're just projecting it out that it's got to be this entity that has killed her or she took her own life. You'll be able to make up your own mind based on a lot of research, Gary, that you've done over the years. A fabulous job and painstaking, because I know how much time both not only you in your own research, but you and Randall will go back and double check and triple check just to make sure. And if we do something calculated like a story narrative, we're making it a calculated guess based on fact. And I think that's really,
Yes.
really important.
Yeah, thank you for that acknowledgement, Nina. Randall and I keep going back to the sources to find the truth and to create a dramatization to illustrate things where you don't have definite words, definite ideas. So you can only draw those conclusions based upon the facts that you know. And so I am proud of the way Randall and I have selected material that really seems to fit. A point I'd like to make about that last summer for Marilyn is the betrayal she really felt by her home studio. I think when people talk about, Marilyn looking forward to the future and all of her plans, that is true. But this was also a time where Marilyn was aging and her contract was ending. She only had 2 final commitments for Fox. What Something's Got to Give was 1 film, and then she owed the studio another film after that. And once that second commitment was completed, she would become a free agent. And so that could afford her a great amount of freedom and artistic control over the work that she wanted to do. But I could imagine at the same time, that can also be frightening to a person who's worked in the studio system and someone who's facing middle age. We know
Yeah.
from Marilyn's letters that she really wanted to get back into a production company with Lee Strasberg and Marlon Brando. And not only did she want to produce her own films outside of Fox now, but to produce the films of others. But the studio itself, who had supported her in her ascent to fame and success, they were now trying to take her down. They
Yeah.
had to justify firing her, and rather than complete the film, what they really wanted was to collect on the insurance money. So if they can portray her as unfit to work and unstable, they can collect that money and not have to complete the film, and that could offset the tremendous losses that Cleopatra was costing them. But they did this at the cost of Marilyn's professional reputation and her livelihood.
And
And
some
so,
things never change too, because if you think about the Hollywood today, look at how quickly somebody's reputation can be damaged because now we have social media and it happens in just 1 minute and things have changed overnight. So I can only imagine how challenging that would be.
I want to make one more point here about something that we put in, that why she was calling Robert Kennedy. And we have that in the beginning of the scene. It was to resolve the situation with Fox. She was looking for any leverage she could have to get this situation decided in her favor. So these repeated calls to the Justice Department in Washington was an attempt to get with Kennedy to secretly work toward helping her in some capacity with Fox. And so if you didn't catch that, go back and listen to the beginning of the scene again, because we mentioned exactly how Kennedy was actually successful at doing that.
Gary.
and it makes sense that Kennedy would want to assist her because one of the reasons that Fox used for terminating Marilyn was that she left the production to appear at President Kennedy's birthday gala. Now, she did have permission in advance to leave early. I think she only missed about 2 days, and then she got ill and wasn't able to come back to work. But they were using that to show that she was breaching her contract. And so this was a command performance. The Kennedy family, the Democratic Party, wanted her there for the success of this fundraiser.
Yeah.
So, this was a way that Kennedy could assist her. And it seems likely that might have happened because the board of Fox in New York during that time period made some very strong decisions that terminated some of the executives who were in charge that would open the way for Marilyn to renegotiate and come back. And many people believe inaccurately that those negotiations were finalized. They were never in writing. They were close to finalization, but they
Were in talks. And I think the other thing that I think is really important for this, guys, is that we hear over and over again, Bobby Kennedy was talking to Marilyn Monroe. So guess what? It's not what you think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Very clearly about the fact that, she was fired and she was more concerned about her career than any guy in her life at that time.
Yes,
So I think we have to
absolutely.
put that into that context. But we have one more scene. I have to say, listening to this scene it was challenging for me to listen to it, and it's just a clip, but it definitely, it is towards the end of Marilyn's life, and we wanted to give you the context of this portion of her life too, because this is the one that past this one phone call, we didn't hear anything left in terms of Marilyn's voice and what she would say anymore, and definitely not on the screen anymore. So it was one of the, I don't know about you guys, but for me, it was a really hard scene to listen to.
I would have to agree with you, Nina. These are Marilyn's last moments of consciousness, and unfortunately, she was connected through the telephone with someone who was unable to help her or rescue her.
Randall, why don't you set us up for this next scene?
Well, as you said, it was a phone call, and the person on the other end of the line was Peter Lawford. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had a chance to give some thought to what you just heard. And we're going to break it down. So once again, I'm joined by my collaborators, Nina and Gary, and we're going to discuss why we put the scene in the show for you and what we would like you to kind of glean from it, since there's been so much conversation about these hours of Marilyn's life and speculation. So let's look at, first of all, the facts behind this moment of time. So Gary, can you start us off with what was going on with Peter Lawford?
Well, Marilyn's true friend in the Lawford family was actually Patricia Kennedy Lawford. She had known Pat Lawford for probably a little over a year, and she had a connection with her. Peter, she had known professionally over the years, but according to Rupert Allen, one of her press agents, she never really trusted Peter Lawford. And so her connection was truly to Pat. But Pat was out of town. She was visiting her family in Hyannisport, and Lawford was a bachelor that weekend and had invited over many friends. And earlier that day, around 5 o'clock, he had invited Marilyn to join them for some Chinese takeout dinner, is what we believe. And Marilyn was kind of uncommitting to that invitation. He then called her back later, and she begged off. And so as the evening progressed and some of the guests were leaving, Lawford was concerned about Marilyn, and so he gave her a call. And in that conversation, he went on record to say that her voice faded away and the phone went dead. And then he was unable to reach her because now the line was busy. And with operator intervention, he learned that the phone was off the hook. So he was engaging anyone he could in checking on Marilyn. And Lawford was very heavily into alcohol, as was his wife. And so we took some liberty as well in depicting him in this state of intoxication, which was later verified by Milton Evans, his agent, whom we've heard in the scene. And so there were other people over at the house that night who have gone on record and discussed it with biographers. There was Joe and Dolores Narr. I believe Dolores is still alive with a different last name. Milton Evans and his wife, Lynn Sherman, the vocalist, they're both gone. And George Bullets Durgam, who is also now gone.
So, Gary, one of the other things that we get asked a lot about, and it's in almost every single documentary, is the famous line, her last lines that say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to Jack the President, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a good guy. Was that really what she said?
Well, this is what we know. That quote comes from a We magazine article from 1975, in which Lawford is allegedly making this statement to the journalist. Now, if you look at the original investigation in Marilyn's death, Peter Lawford was in the newspaper in many articles in the week following Marilyn's death. And the reason for that was the police were investigating who her last contacts were, any ingoing or outgoing calls, because they were hoping that interviewing those who spoke to her would provide insight into Marilyn intentionally or accidentally overdosing. And they were also looking to see if any conversations might have been a trigger for her to make an attempt on her life or take her life. So, in what Lawford actually said to those investigating, and let me just point out that the Los Angeles Police Department interviewed Lawford again in 1975 based upon this interview. And those documents are discoverable and we can all access them. And what Lawford said to the police was that he believed Marilyn sounded depressed and over-medicated. Her voice was slurred and she faded out and the phone went dead. And then he was interviewed again during the reinvestigation in 1982, and he basically repeated the same of what he said in 1975.
Gary, was Milton Evans ever on record with saying anything about this phone call and what happened?
It's been overlooked over the years. I would say this is the crux of the whole situation because these folks had an opportunity to rescue Marilyn and save her, and that did not happen. And many people were involved and made decisions and judgments which resulted in no one going to her home and actually checking on her or calling paramedics to her home, which was really indicated at the time. Much of this came to light in 1985 with Anthony Summers' investigation in his book and his documentary. And so Ebbins did speak to the press at the time. He gave a rather thorough account of the conversation, and we're using it in this episode and in the extended version of this scene in future episodes. He was supposedly going to write a book about it, which he never did. But the gist of it was that Lawford was intoxicated, was in no condition to drive, and Ebbins was protecting him. He had a financial responsibility as his agent not to create any kind of sensational press for him. And Ebbins thought it would be best that they contact Dr. Greenson or Dr. Greenson's brother-in-law, Milton Rudin, who was actually Marilyn's attorney. So he felt it was more appropriate for those folks to become involved rather than Peter Lawford, who was now the brother-in-law of the President of the United States, and for him to be implicated in a medical emergency involving a woman who was potentially experiencing a psychiatric crisis. Ebbins felt that was something that Lawford should protect himself from. And apparently, allegedly, Lawford felt extreme guilt for this. And I think within the context of the era and what was going on a Saturday night, we could imagine that people were socializing and they were drinking. And I think Milton Ebbins was up until 4 o'clock that night because Mort Saul, the comedian, was, visiting with him.
I think the hard thing too, Gary, is that, when somebody's intoxicated, it's really interesting what they remember, and are they even remembering it accurately?
Correct.
I
Correct.
mean, if you think about somebody being really, really drunk, and it's obvious that he was that night. So, I think there was a lot of people and a lot of things that went wrong that night. And it's too bad that Peter's plea to actually have her looked on through the events. And that's also what causes this controversy of what actually happened to her. Because in some ways, some of it doesn't make sense of why wouldn't you go check on her, especially Eunice Murray. I still go back to that, like, why didn't she take the time to go and check on Marilyn? And that'll be another episode, guys, that we will be getting to down the road in these series of Marilyn's life. Is there anything else you want to add before we close this episode out?
Well, I think I want to just draw the analogy with the question of why did Marilyn Monroe die young under these circumstances, trying to look for one answer. And it just reminds me of the investigation into what caused the Titanic to sink. There was just a constellation of a lot of factors and contributing events. And so when we look at Marilyn's death, we see the same constellation of many things that led to it. And if one thing were maybe different, it might have changed the final outcome. But we've talked about the medications. We've talked about the psychiatric condition. We talked about prescribing practices. We've talked about people who heard her in distress and the decisions that they took. It begins to build and build and build upon itself. And so it's not just necessarily one thing or one person or one situation we need to look at. We really need to look at all of these contributing factors, and that's what we intend to do. Our goal is to provide all of this information, much of it which has not been spotlighted, but which is extremely pertinent and important information in trying to make a conclusion. And ultimately, the goal is for our audience and our listeners to sort through that information, provided in an unbiased way, and to draw conclusions.
Yeah, their own conclusion. I think that's really important. And speaking of conclusions, you actually have a third book coming out to complement book 3 in the Icon series. So tell us about this.
Icon, The Lifetimes and Films of Marilyn Monroe, the third volume, The Death Investigation. I've been asked by my readers to do this for many years, and I have to say, Nina and Randall, I have resisted I have resisted doing this because in all of my research and writing on Marilyn, I did not want to focus upon her death. I really wanted to focus on her life and her resilience. But I feel at this point I can no longer sidestep this because I have access to a lot of important information that I want to share. This information has been available to many others who have dismissed it. So I really want the public to see that because I think it's important, it's available, and there's no reason to hide it. And I think it will ultimately push aside so much information and so
Yeah.
many nonsense. I just
And it's
feel a
coming out.
responsibility to do it.
You're one of the most beloved biographers of Marilyn, and I think that it says the reason why is because you do take the time to accurately flush out anything that may just be a rumor. And you and I have gone back and forth on things, and you'll say, Nina, yeah, but look at it this way. And I think that's what we have to do. I mean, it's so easy in the age of quick bites, right, to literally just take it as fact, and to, in this case particularly, because it's been so many years, and this new book is coming out on her 60th anniversary of the year of her 60th
Yes,
anniversary,
I
right?
have a deadline. It has to be edited and released before August of 2022. So I've been working feverishly on it. I took a break for a long time, and I think I disappointed many people, but I wasn't in the space to be able to do it. But I'm really feeling like I am in the space, and it's moving along really beautifully right now. And I think the readers will enjoy it, and I'm really enjoying putting it
Well,
together.
we're all excited, and we'll be doing hopefully more and more of these episodes. But as you can tell, with sound effects and actors and sound design and editors, it's a much more elaborate production. So Randall, why don't you bring us to our next step with our listeners and what we're inviting them to do?
Well, as we're coming to the close of this episode, I feel it's really important that we kind of let people know that we started off with the period of 1961, and we really focused a lot on these last 2 years of Marilyn's life, and now we're ending on her last day. But in the season 2 that we have planned, we're going to do something that's never been done before. I don't think anyone's really covered Marilyn's adolescence. And we looked at in season 1 her childhood and the trauma that resulted from that. In season 2, we're going to explore the change in Marilyn when how she overcame that traumatic childhood and started to build a life for herself and build an identity, and those people in her life that help her to do that. So this is a period of her life from age 8 or 9 to the period of when she was married at age 16. So there's really never been a TV show or a movie that's highlighted these years. And I can tell you from what we now know, Gary's research, my research, things that we have from auction, this is an extremely important period to look at because this is the beginning of Marilyn Monroe. It begins here. So this is what we want to show you and have you hear in season 2. So we're very excited about it. We've got a lot of these episodes mapped out. But what we need now is, for all of you listeners, is we really need your support in moving forward. We've gone through a lot of expense to do these episodes. There's
Just
been,
a little bit.
yeah, there's been a lot of people donating time, and there's a lot to creating these. So we really want to ask your help by sharing this podcast, giving us reviews, rating the show, and we're going to start doing something else. And that is, we're going to set up a crowdfunding place that you can donate to the show and be a part of the second season. And we're going to be providing more information about that in the near future to you. And on that crowdfunding place, that we will detail some of the things that we're going to do and that you will be supporting. And we'll have some really nice gifts for those people who support us. Everyone that does so will help us move faster in terms of getting these episodes produced.
Because here's the thing, everybody wants to go to the last day. And there's so much more involved in this. And I can't tell you, we've gotten emails, particularly now that they know that this episode is out. Oh my gosh, this is my favorite podcast. I mean, we've been getting these wonderful, wonderful emails and posts and comments. So if you really do love it, helping us out to get these episodes out, it is really a labor of love, and we're trying to do it right and not sensationalize. So with that, we're going to ask you for your support. You'll be hearing from us very shortly, but let's hold a good thought, not only for Marilyn, but for this podcast as well, that we can continue in season 2.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and being a part of this journey for us. We've really enjoyed producing these for you and looking forward to doing more.
As we always end all of our Facebook Lives and some of our interviews, let's say farewell the way we do with Marilyn.
In 2021, hold a good thought for Marilyn, and be sure to hold a good thought for yourself, and be kind to yourself and to others.